Over the late 20th century, a lot of surplus warships were spread around the world. The vast majority of these were, unsurprisingly, American. Destroyers and destroyer escorts being by far the most common, with literal hundreds of assorted Fletchers, Sumners, Gearings, and so forth. This isn't surprising. In a previous video, I covered USS John Rogers, the last of the Fletchers in active service. In this video, however, we'll be looking to a surplus Royal Navy destroyer. Post-war British sails are generally focused on their light fleet carriers, with good reason. Ships like Hermes lasted quite a long time. However, one of their destroyers lasted about as long, well into the early 21st century. That ship, HMS Zenith, is the topic of this video. While her career under that name was very short, her time in the Egyptian Navy lasted far longer. Admittedly, details of that service are pretty sparse, at least in English language sources. Even the ship's ultimate fate is something you have to dig through pictures to find, because most sources will fall off a cliff circa 2016. Let's look at that story now and try to figure out exactly what happened to the longest-serving World War II British destroyer. The story of HMS Zenith began much the same as many other ships. Crash building programs as the combatant navies in the Second World War scrambled to replace losses, or alternatively, just try to keep up with a sudden need for all the ships. In the British case, that took the shape of the War Emergency Program, relatively small destroyers based on pre-war designs to get out as quickly as humanly possible. The ships that resulted varied quite a bit between flotillas, as new equipment was put aboard whenever it became available. Zenith, laid down on May 19th of 1942, was part of the W and Z class, which were, fundamentally, a repeat of their immediate predecessors, the U and V class, with different fire control directors, and a new 4.5-inch gun that could elevate to 55 degrees for better dual-purpose use. I'll do a more detailed breakdown in a future video. For now, a Cliff Notes description of her design details. Zenith displaced around 1,700 tons standard, rising to 2,500 tons at full load. On that displacement, she carried four 4.5-inch, 114mm guns and single mounts, 2 super firing on the bow and 2 super firing on the stern. To support these weapons, the ship also carried 8 torpedo tubes and 2 quadruple mounts mounted amidships. Light anti-aircraft weaponry is a more open question. This could vary wildly across the career of the ships, as was common during the Second World War. It would generally feature some combination of 40mm pom-poms, 40mm Bofors, and 20mm cannon. The exact number and combination varying on the time period and ship. A more firm number can be found with the final weapon, the depth charges. This would have been a total of 70 depth charges with 2 racks. All of this was pushed through the water by 40,000 shaft horsepower through 2 shafts, for a speed of around 37 knots. And with that covered, I'll move on to her service history, beginning with the very brief time the destroyer spent with the Royal Navy. As said earlier, HMS Zenith was laid down in mid-1942. The destroyer would only launch on June 5th, 1944, slightly longer than 2 years after she was laid down in May of 1942. This long construction period is a reflection of how stressed British shipbuilding was at the time, although the fitting out process would progress much faster. The destroyer commissioned into the Royal Navy on December 22nd, 1944. About half a year after her launching. Unfortunately for Zenith, she would see 2 issues that prevented her from serving in active combat. First, by the end of 1944, there wasn't really much to fight. The U-boats had largely been neutered by this point, and the Japanese Navy was a shadow of its former self. Second, and more importantly, the destroyer was almost immediately put into dry dock for repair work. Some defects cropped up in Zenith's construction, requiring a lengthy refit. From February to May of 1945, the destroyer was stuck in dock. This was both to fix the defects, but also to remove Arctic equipment. No longer necessary for the European theater, Zenith was instead fitted out for tropical service in the Pacific. However, this would also come to nothing. Zenith finished her post-refit trials in June of 1945 and began to work up for Pacific service in July. This process would see the destroyer in the Mediterranean come August, when the Japanese surrendered. HMS Zenith was, as a result, too late to see combat duty in the Second World War. By no means is she unique in this, although it is worth noting. What is also worth noting is that at least one source states the ship was present to support British landings in Malaya. It seems to be limited to that source, British invasion fleets by John de Windsor, however, so take that with a grain of salt. Might be true, might not, and it's hard to be sure without digging through archives, for records that may or may not even exist. In any case, with no enemies to fight, Zenith returned to the British Isles. By 1947, the destroyer was paid off into reserve. While a good chunk of her fellow war emergency destroyers would be modified into anti-submarine frigates, Zenith was not among them. She would receive a minor refit in 1950, but this was mostly focused on keeping the ship in serviceable condition. At the conclusion of this refit, Zenith was right back into reserve, where the ship would remain in spite of plans to put her through the Type 15 frigate conversion. Instead, Zenith was sold to Egypt in May of 1955, in more or less her wartime configuration, aside from some minor changes to make her more suitable for Egyptian service. She went alongside her sister ship, HMS Mings. Mings was renamed ENS El Fateh and would be sunk in 1970. That's a story I'll cover in a future video. Zenith, meanwhile, was renamed El Fateh, and at this point, her story becomes murky. While there might be Arabic language sources on this, I haven't found them. English language sources are, for their part, incredibly bare bones. The destroyer joined the Egyptian fleet and did not participate in any notable battles with Israel, at least as far as I've been able to find. By 1963, she was back in Britain for a refit. This would conclude in 1964, at which point El Fateh returned to Egypt. At some point after this, the destroyer was reduced to training duty. Exactly when, I'm not sure. NavalHistory.net, for its part, says she served for 15 years after the conclusion of the 1960s refit. The usual caveats about relying on online sources apply here. But, if that's accurate, the destroyer lasted in frontline use until 1979, progressively refit with various upgraded equipment, possibly including gear of Soviet origin. Regardless of exactly when the training ship duties took over, El Fateh would remain in that role until the 21st century. At least 2004, as I found a picture, shown here, of the destroyer in Alexandria that year, still fully kitted out and in apparently decent condition. That would put her past John Rogers, which was retired in 2001. On the other hand, this photo, uploaded in 2007, shows the ship stripped of her weaponry. The hull isn't particularly rusty or in bad shape from what the quality of the image allows us to see, so she might still have been serving in training roles at that point, be it stationary or sailing. You'll see various online sources differ on things past this point. I've seen both 2014 and 2016 bandied about as when the ship finally left service. Either one would be an incredibly long active career, with the ship lasting 70 to 72 years, respectively. It certainly didn't last past 2017, when the name El Fateh was passed on to a new ship. However, from Google Earth scanning, it seems the ship was scrapped from late 2015 to early 2016, so I would go for 2014 at the absolute latest for leaving service. El Fateh was moored alongside her longtime mooring partner, the equally old Tariq, until October of 2015, as seen here. By the end of November 2015, she was moved to a new berth and stripped bare. You can see the superstructure on the pier next to the ship, including her distinctive British destroyer bridge. One can make the argument this was to refit the ship, if not for the progression of pictures. She looked more or less the same in February of 2016. However, a month later, at the end of March, the ship was much further along in scrapping. You can see the rest of the superstructure is gone, including the bits on the pier. Furthermore, the deck has been cut away enough to expose what I believe to be the power plant. April 2016 doesn't have a good quality image, but I'll still put it on screen. More or less the same from what I can tell. On the other hand, May of 2016 shows the destroyer moved to a new berth and basically torn down to nearly the waterline. June 2016 has yet another move-in berth with even more of the deck gone. There's very little left of the old Zenith at this point. And by August of 2016, even that is completely gone. I searched throughout Alexandria on Google Earth, but there's no sign of her. So I think it's safe to say the ex-HMS Zenith was scrapped completely between July and August of 2016. Most sources will say the ship is still around, but I can see no evidence of that. Granted, without actually going to Alexandria in person, it's impossible to say. Evidence does lean that way, however, which is a shame because she was a one-of-a-kind ship by that point. And this is where her story comes to an end. But there is one postscript to make. El Fateh's longtime berthing mate, Tariq, is still around. The former HMS Wimbrel, a Black Swan-class sloop. This ship was moved to a new work area next to an old dry dock in late 2021, and the ship has remained in that same spot with no major visible changes ever since. The furthest Google Earth goes for the area is May of 2023. But, as of a year ago, Tariq was still sitting there. One can hope that means this ship, at least, might survive where Zenith didn't. We'll see what the future brings in that regard. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.